Hey, it's Mike here. If you were ever to see my car, you would know I am not exactly Mr. Punctual about things like maintenance. I will forget about an oil change until that blinking light reminds me. So I guess Car Care to Go is designed for folks like me, and I suspect it's designed for a lot of the folks who listen to our show too. You make an appointment, they show up, pick up your ride, and bring it back a few hours later with the oil changed, the wipers replaced, and the seats tidied. They are accessible all over DC. Instead of sitting in a waiting room drinking bad coffee, why not sit at home and drink your own coffee while they do the work? Get your first synthetic oil change for just $20.23. Get it? That's 2023 with the code FIRST20. No catch. Any make or model. Sign up at carcaretogo.com.
Here's what DC's talking about. Communities along the Anacostia River have a rich history of fighting for environmental justice. And now, the Anacostia Community Museum just opened a Center for Environmental Justice. It draws on the neighborhood's legacy, sets up impressive programming for both kids and adults, and spotlights marginalized voices who, despite being at the forefront of the issue, are often left out of conversations about the environment. Today's Monday, April 24th. I'm Bridget Todd, and this is CityCast DC. So Melanie Adams, you're the director of the Anacostia Community Museum, which just launched the Center for Environmental Justice. Now, I know the ACM has been working on issues regarding environmental justice since its founding. How has that played into the museum's history and the history of Anacostia more broadly?
The Anacostia Community Museum, we were founded back in 1967. So we were founded by the Smithsonian. So Anacostia has always been our home. And the reason why the Smithsonian Center for Environmental Justice is going to be based in Anacostia really is because we're the Smithsonian Museum that really has been doing the work related to issues of environmental justice. One of our first exhibits, which took place in 1970, was called The Rat, Man's Invited Affliction. So talk about something that's even relevant now.
Very relevant.
Yes. And so this was a whole exhibit examining the rat issue in Southeast and really what was man's role in this proliferation of rats. And this was a groundbreaking exhibit at the time. We actually had live rats, but it really helped to begin to tell that environmental story of people in the environment. And so many times people think of the environment as something that you go to, if that makes sense. So people think like you go to the park, you go on a hike, that's the environment. And what we're really trying to explain to people, your environment is where you live. You are surrounded by your environment on a regular basis. And so starting off with that rat exhibit really began to set the stage for the work we would do moving forward. Our focus has really been along the Anacostia waterways. 2010, we actually started the program Urban Waterways. And then in 2018, we launched Women's Environmental Leadership. So this is a wonderful opportunity for women of all generations to come together around this issue of environmental justice, because as you know, in order to be it, you have to see it. And you have so many young women of color who may want to go into this field and they don't see anyone who looks like them doing this work. And so bringing them together with women of color who are doing the work on an annual basis to have these discussions about working in the field has also been really important to us.
Yeah, that's so important because, so often the environmental space can be very white and male. And it doesn't really make sense when you think about it because marginalized people are certainly disproportionately impacted by issues regarding the environment and climate and environmental justice in particular.
Well, and I think as we both know, women of color have always been working on these issues. They may not have been in the forefront. So that's what ends up happening. As I like to say, African-American women and their children are usually the canaries in the coal mine in this type of thing where a woman is trying to figure out, sitting around the kitchen table, why her child is sick. Is it the air? Is it the water? Is it the dirt? Something is, happening. And so a lot of times it's these women of color who are trying to figure out how can they solve this environmental issue so they can have a healthy place for their child to live.
I mean, you just articulated what I'm familiar with as the concept of environmental justice. But for folks who might be listening who might not be familiar with that phrase, what is environmental justice?
we're using the definition of the Environmental Protection Agency. So essentially, they say environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement, which is key, meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, natural origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And part of the reason why I really like that is so many times people just think it's all about the treatment, and they don't recognize that people of color need to be at the table when these laws and regulations and policies are put in place. Because as you mentioned, a lot of times they impact them and they find out about it on the back end.
Exactly. So what is the new Environmental Justice Center?
So the Environmental Justice Center, really the purpose of this center is to do a few different things. First and most importantly, it's to center community. That's what we do at the Anacostia Community Museum. So many times when you think of environmental justice, you go directly to the science. And of course, we believe in the science, but we also believe in the community and the community's ability to solve its own problems. It's also to raise awareness. A lot of people really, before these types of things started hitting the media, a lot of people weren't even aware of systematic injustices related to urban environments. So whether it was things like, water, I think COVID brought that out when people were figuring out a lot of people had underlying conditions, specifically asthma, based on the communities that they lived in. We also want this center to really begin crafting community-driven solutions. As we know, we want to make sure that it's those on the ground who are impacted in this have really an opportunity to begin looking at solutions. And finally, and most importantly, that they see their own power in creating a more equitable and just environment. And I think that ties directly into the vision of the Anacostia Community Museum, which really is for urban communities to activate their collective power to create a more equitable future. So in a nutshell, the Center for Environmental Justice really will center community and their power to make positive change.
Cold War era defectors sold secrets outside the British Embassy on Mass Ave. Allied operatives met at the Mayflower Hotel in 1925 and again in 2010. And odds are there was a spy on your train this morning. With more than 10,000 spies, DC truly is the capital of spycraft. And if you want to understand their secrets, step into their radio-transmitting shoes, or into James Bond's Aston Martin, you need to visit the International Spy Museum. Located just off the National Mall, the Spy Museum features 2 floors of exhibits and artifacts. They've got ciphers, submarines, and the actual ice axe that killed Leon Trotsky. While most DC museums discouraged me from touching the artwork, the Spy Museum gave me an undercover identity and tested my skills as a covert operative in a series of interactive challenges. Book your visit today at spymuseum.org. Right Proper is a community-focused brewing company creating soulful, intentional, balanced beers. You may know Right Proper for their flagship pale ale, Raised by Wolves, or for their recreation of the historic DC lager called Senate Beer. Want to visit in person? Check out their 2 locations. Shaw Brew Pub and Kitchen has home-brewed American beers and American fare with a touch of Southern comfort. It's open 7 days a week, lunch and brunch Friday to Sunday, and happy hour Monday to Friday. And in Brookland, they've got production hours and a tap room. It's open Wednesday to Sunday with happy hour Wednesday to Friday from 12 to 6. It's all made right here in the Douglas Commonwealth for nearly 10 years. Everything Right Proper does is done with brilliant hospitality and a touch of whimsy. You can follow along at Right Proper Beer.
You talked about COVID being a real turning point for folks who maybe had not thought about environmental justice and the environment and how it impacts their everyday, lived experience. I do think that when it comes to things like the environment, it's so easy for folks to say, listen, I'm trying to put food on my table. I'm trying to make it to work on time. I don't have time to worry about what's happening with my environment. With so many issues to care about, why would you argue that folks should see that environmental justice really should be a priority and really does impact their lived experience?
Right. And I think that makes sense. People don't recognize the issues related to the environment until they impact them personally. And I think that's why we haven't really seen this this connection of more communities of color really recognizing it. And I use the COVID example because we know asthma is an underlying condition in the African American community. And so respiratory illness made COVID worse. And so between that and lead paint, if you think about water quality, there are so many issues that impact communities of color that you're kind of forced to pay attention to it, even if there are larger issues such as housing, education, jobs, all of these things. You can't do any of those things if you're not healthy. We're also hoping people understand that environmental justice is not just about having a wonderful garden and great air and all of these things, but it's also creating a healthy environment for you, your family to prosper.
Yeah, I like how you point out the way that all these issues are sort of connected. Like, it's not just about having your garden. It's like environmental justice is racial justice, it's gender justice, it's class justice.
Right. And that's one of the things that really we've been working to place environmental justice within the different social justice movements. And as we know, all of these different movements, whether it's the civil rights movement, the women's movement, LGBTQ, they're all kind of based around a strong foundation around the idea of justice. And we're saying that really environmental justice really needs to be a strong civic issue for people. As we know, what's happening, with the world and specifically with the country around issues of the environment. So it's important. And I think the other thing is, again, it's really letting people understand when you walk out your door, you're in the environment. You don't have to go hiking. And that's too many times what we think about. As you just said, it's like people are like, the environment's over there. And we're like, no, the environment's out your front door.
So in terms of the Center for Environmental Justice, what do you imagine this space being used for? How do you imagine it functioning?
So right now, we actually are launching a variety of different programs that will come out of the center. So the center is not necessarily a physical space right now. It's really more of the different programmatic aspects. So one program that we recently launched that I'm really excited about is our Environmental Justice Academy. So these are young women and non-binary individuals in the DC region who are spending roughly 6 months together, hybrid and in person, exploring issues of the environment and specifically around the Anacostia waterway. And part of the reason why I really love that program is, again, exactly about everything we've been talking about. Before they thought about this program, they didn't really think as much about the environment or how it impacted them. They really were interested in, like you said, issues around social justice and communities of color and creating more equitable opportunities. So these 35 young people now are ensconced in this idea of, environmental justice really is a civic issue. And in order to be an informed citizen, they need to know why it's important to support issues of environmental justice. We'll be having our Women's Environmental Leadership Summit this fall. So that'll welcome 250 individuals to our nation's capital for roughly a 3-day summit to talk about issues related to the environment and specifically being a woman in that role. We've always had a community garden program. And this year, we were excited to launch a children's gardening program. So it'll be 8 weeks of children learning about how to grow their own fruits and vegetables in their gardens. That's another thing we're excited about. And it's not only the programmatic aspect, we also are really diving deep into the history. So it's collecting oral histories from individuals that have been active in the environmental justice movement. And a lot of these oral histories are actually serving as the foundation for an exhibit we're opening on May 19th. To Live and Breathe, Women's Environmental Justice in DC. And so this really takes the stories of those who came before us, who've really been working in this field for decades and really telling those stories and showing, more importantly, how women have always been at the forefront of this environmental justice movement.
Oh, that's so lovely. What do you see as the future of this work?
I really see the future of this work as more people getting involved. I mean, I took this job in 2019. I was not aware of this component of the museum. Like, the museum has an amazing history and reputation in the museum field, but I was not aware of this strong work around environmental issues. And the thing that makes it unique, it's not only the way we center community, But so many times you see more of this environmental work out of science centers or science museums. You don't necessarily see them in a multidisciplinary museum like ACM. And that's really the other important part, is how we're bringing the humanities into this conversation. So we're bringing the people in addition to the science.
Beautiful. Melanie Adams, thank you so much for being here. I learned a lot.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
And before you go, some quick news. Councilmember Brooke Pinto wants D.C. to change its air conditioning codes. Currently, the city requires buildings with AC to have it running between May 15th and September 15th. But with temperatures in the 80s this April, Pinto wants to move the date up. She hopes to bring up this issue at the Board in Question's May meeting. Meanwhile, the Smithsonian is reconsidering its choice for the new head of the American Women's History Museum. It turns out that at her last job, 3 women accused Nancy Yao of firing them for reporting sexual harassment incidents. Yao denies retaliating. The Smithsonian hasn't laid out a timeline for its review. We've also previously reported that it's struggling to find a site for the museum Yao is meant to lead. Also, Metro released renderings of the new 8000 series trains. They include more horizontal bench seating along the walls instead of back-to-back seating we've got now. It's all to create gangways that you can walk through and more space for bikes, wheelchairs, and luggage. Metro will have a pop-up in May to gather feedback from riders. Weigh in now because Metro's funding situation is in flux, and who knows what other nice things we'll be able to get. And lastly, today's DC life hack is... The Smithsonian Postal Service Museum is fabulous for little kids. They have all kinds of vehicles that mail gets delivered in, and you could actually get into one. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. And if you enjoyed the show, why not tell your favorite outdoor enthusiast and subscribe to our morning newsletter? We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.